They took his pension, his house, and the truck, and signed it all over with his own shaking hand, and forgot, in the rush to take everything that was visible, the 1 acre of dead farmland his father had left him. The acre nobody had bothered to read the deed on. Walter Henneman was 74 years old, and for 41 of those years he had farmed 380 acres of wheat and milo 6 miles east of Colby, Kansas, on land his father, Otto Henneman, had broken with a team of mules in 1931. Walter had married Carol Ann Pruitt in the spring of 1973 in the Lutheran church on Route 25, and they had been married 49 years when she died of a stroke in her sleep on a Tuesday in March, 11 months before this story begins. Walter still made coffee for 2 most mornings. He had not figured out, even after 11 months, how to stop. He had run the farm alone the last 3 years, since his hip made the combine seat a 40-minute proposition instead of a 4-hour one, leasing the row crop ground to a neighbor. But keeping the house, the shop, and the home quarter for himself, the way a man keeps the part of a thing that still feels like his. He had built that shop with his own hands in 1986, poured the slab himself, framed it himself, wired it with the help of his brother-in-law who'd been an electrician in Hayes. He could still tell you which stud in the north wall was slightly out of plumb because he'd cut it short and shimmed it rather than waste the lumber. And 40 years later, it still held. A blue heeler named Scout had lived in that shop for 13 years, sleeping under the workbench more often than in the house in recent seasons, because the shop still smelled, faintly, the way it always had, diesel and cut lumber and something underneath that. Scout had been his late son's dog originally, picked out of a litter near Oakley the year before the accident, and had simply stayed on afterward, the way some animals do, attaching themselves to whoever is left. The week before Carol Ann's funeral, Walter had still found time to fix the parsonage's back step at the Lutheran church, because the pastor mentioned in passing that it had been loose for a month and nobody had gotten to it. And Walter, even in grief, could not walk past a thing that needed fixing and pretend he hadn't noticed. He'd done it in 40 minutes with tools from his own truck, the same hands that had built his shop in 1986, still knowing exactly how deep to set a screw in cottonwood without splitting the grain. It was the kind of competence nobody thought to mention about him anymore, because everyone in town had started, in the last 11 months, to see only the widower and not the man underneath the widower. His daughter Renee lived in Wichita, 4 hours west on I-70, and the two of them had not spoken more than a handful of times since Carol Ann's funeral. Not because of any single fight, but because grief had made them both quieter in ways that hadn't found their way back to each other yet. Renee had a 15-year-old daughter, Walter's only grandchild, whom he had seen twice in the last 2 years, both times at gatherings too crowded and too short to say anything that mattered. His son had died in a combine accident in 2009, age 31, on this same ground, which was a fact. Walter did not say out loud anymore, because saying it out loud cost him something he could not afford to spend twice in one conversation. His grandnephew, Curtis Tibbetts, his late sister's grandson, 38 years old, a man Walter had not laid eyes on more than a dozen times in his life, before the last 18 months, started showing up on Sundays the autumn after Carol Ann died with a casserole dish. Curtis worked in agricultural equipment, finance out of Salina, a job he described, the first time he sat at Walter's kitchen table, as helping farmers like you stay current with the world. He drove a Ram pickup that had cost $58,000 new, and he wore a quarter-zip pullover with his company's logo stitched on the chest, even on Sundays when there was no reason to. He had a way of speaking to Walter slowly, the way you'd speak to someone you suspected might not follow, though Walter's mind was as clear at 74 as it had been at 50, a fact Curtis seemed determined not to notice. Walter had met Curtis exactly 9 times before Carol Ann's funeral, mostly at holiday gatherings 2 decades apart, and could not, if pressed, have said much about the man beyond his name and the fact that he was his late sister's grandson. The Curtis who showed up that first Sunday after the funeral with a casserole dish and a softer voice than Walter remembered was, as far as Walter could tell at the time, simply a young relative finally getting around to checking on family. It would be many months before Walter understood that the timing of that first visit, 6 weeks after the death, just long enough to seem respectful and not a day longer, had been deliberate. "Uncle Walter," Curtis said, on the second Sunday, setting his fork down with the particular care of a man about to say something he'd rehearsed, "I just want to make sure nobody takes advantage of you out here. A man your age, alone on 380 acres. That's a lot for anybody to manage. I see it happen to widowers all the time in my line of work. Predatory lenders. Equipment leases that don't make sense. I'd hate for that to happen to you." It was, Walter would think later, a reasonable thing to say. That was the trouble with Curtis from the start. Every sentence he said was reasonable on its own, the way a single card is just a card, until you noticed you'd been dealt a whole hand. By December, Curtis had a name for what he was doing: getting Uncle Walter's affairs in order. He brought a folder to the kitchen table, a good one, leather-cornered, the kind you bought specifically because of how it looked when you set it down. And inside it were papers explaining that Walter's farm equipment, 22 years old and worth, by Curtis's own appraisal, could be refinanced against a modernization loan that would let Walter retire with dignity instead of working himself into the ground at his age, alone, with nobody checking on him. Walter had asked, the first time, what exactly he was retiring into, since he owned his house outright and had no debt of any kind. A fact he was quietly proud of and had been since 1994. "That's exactly the kind of question that shows you need someone looking out for you," Curtis said, and smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. And Walter, 11 months a widower, sleeping 4 hours a night, eating because Carol Ann would have wanted him to, and not because he was hungry, signed the first paper in January without reading past the second page. It went the way these things go once the first signature is on the table. By April, the equipment was refinanced through a finance company called Heartland Ag Capital Partners, which turned out to be a shell. Curtis had registered himself in Delaware 11 months earlier. The same month, Carol Ann died, a detail Walter would not learn until much later. By June, the modernization loan had a balloon payment Walter could not make, which Curtis had known from the day he wrote it, and the balloon payment forced the sale of the equipment at a liquidation auction that recovered $18,000 against a $31,000 loan, leaving Walter owing $13,000 he did not have. By August, Curtis was back at the kitchen table with another folder, this one explaining, with the gentle patience of a man delivering bad news he had caused himself, that the simplest path forward, the path that would let Walter stay in his own house, keep his dignity, avoid a lawsuit from the finance company, was to sign over the 380 acres of leased row crop ground in the home quarter, all of it, in exchange for the finance company forgiving the $13,000 and Curtis personally guaranteeing Walter a home for life in a small house Curtis owned in Colby, a house Walter had never seen 11 blocks from the grain elevator, with a yard the size of a garden plot, traw. Before he signed anything that time, Walter drove himself into Colby, the last week he'd have the truck without asking, and sat in the office of a young lawyer named Pete Garrity, who'd taken over the practice from a man who'd done Walter's will 15 years earlier and had since passed away. Garrity read through Curtis's folder for 20 minutes without saying anything, then looked up. "I can fight this," Garrity said. "I want to be straight with you, though. It would take 8 months, minimum, probably longer. And it would cost more than you have liquid right now to even start, because we'd need to depose the finance company and prove the relationship between Curtis and the LLC that holds your equipment debt. You'd need to live somewhere during that fight. And there's a real chance, at the end of 8 months, a judge looks at the fact that you understood what you were signing well enough to come see a lawyer about an earlier version of it, and rules against you anyway. What do you think I should do? Walter said. I think, Garrity said, and Walter could tell the man hated saying it. You should read this version very carefully and decide if a home for life and a clean $13,000 is worth more to you right now than a fight you might lose anyway. I'm not telling you to sign it. I'm telling you I can't promise you winning costs less than losing. Walter went home and did not sleep that night, and the next morning he called Garrity's office and told the receptionist he wasn't going to pursue it. He told himself it was arithmetic. Mostly, it was that Carol Ann's chair was still at the kitchen table, and some mornings he could not get past the chair to think about anything else. And a fight that lasted 8 months felt, that August, like a fight he did not have 8 months of anything left to give. I'm not taking anything from you, Uncle Walter, Curtis said, sliding the paper across the table 2 days later. The casserole dish, chicken and rice, the same one every Sunday now, still steaming between them. I'm protecting what's left. You're 74. You can't keep doing this. I'm trying to be the only person in this family who's actually showing up for you. You've showed up every Sunday for 18 months, Walter said. It was not quite a question. That's right, Curtis said, and smiled the smile that did not reach his eyes. Somebody has to. Walter signed it. He would tell himself later that he signed it because he was tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, because Carol Ann's chair was still at that table and he could not look at it and think clearly at the same time, because Curtis had brought the casserole every Sunday for 18 months, and consistency it felt in the wreckage of that year, like something close to love. He signed the house, the 380 acres, the shop he'd built stud by stud, and the truck. A 2014 Ford his son had helped him pick out, into Curtis Tibbetts' name, on the 19th of August, in exchange for a key to a house he'd never seen and a number, $13,000, that no longer existed anywhere, except as the reason he'd lost everything else. What Curtis did not take, because Curtis did not know it existed, was a single acre at the southwest corner of Section 1-4. A 1-acre parcel that had been split off from the main farm in a 1958 partition Otto Henneman had filed with the county and then never mentioned to anyone for the next 31 years of his life, including his own son. The deed to that acre had passed to Walter automatically on Otto's death in 1989, recorded under a slightly different legal description than the rest of the farm. The Henneman Triangle, the county called it informally, because of its odd shape, bounded by an old section line, a drainage easement. It had not produced a crop since 1958. It was rock and clay and box elder scrub, fenced on one side with leaning posts and rusted wire, and it was in the eyes of anyone who had ever looked at it, including Walter himself, for the better part of 33 years, worth nothing. Curtis's lawyer, drafting the transfer documents, had pulled the legal description from the most recent property tax statement, which listed the farm under one parcel number. The Henneman Triangle, carrying its own separate older parcel number from the 1958 partition, simply did not appear. Curtis took everything that was on the tax bill. He did not know there was an acre. The last morning in the farmhouse before the movers came, Walter walked through every room once, the way he imagined a man walks through a hospital corridor he won't be returning to. He stood in the kitchen where Carol Ann had stood at that same stove for 49 years, ran his hand along the counter she'd had installed in 1991 after saving for it 2 years. and stood for a long moment in the doorway of the bedroom where his son had slept, until he was 18. He did not let himself linger in any one room more than a minute or two because he had learned in the 11 months since the funeral exactly how fast lingering could turn into something he couldn't climb back out of before noon. He moved into the house on Ash Street in Colby on the 1st of September, bringing 4 boxes, his late wife's rocking chair, and Scout, because the dog had nowhere else to go either, and Curtis had not wanted him in the deal. "He's old, Uncle Walter. He probably won't make it through winter anyway. No sense complicating the paperwork." Walter had said nothing and loaded the dog into the truck. The truck he was at that point still allowed to drive before Curtis re-registered it 3 weeks later and asked for the keys back with the same gentle, reasonable voice he used for everything. The house itself was 612 square feet, single-wall construction, a kitchen with 2 working burners out of 4, and a bathroom with a shower stall that had been re-caulked so many times the caulk itself had started to mildew. He set the boxes on the kitchen floor that first night, because there was nowhere else yet to set them, and he went through each one slowly, the way you go through anything when you've stopped being in a hurry about your own life. The first box held kitchen things: a cast-iron skillet Carol Ann had used every Sunday for 46 years, 3 mismatched coffee mugs, a recipe box with her handwriting fading on the index cards. The second held clothes, his and hers both, because he had not been able to decide in the rush of the move what to leave behind of hers and what to keep, and so he had kept all of it. The third held tools, not the farm tools. Those had gone with the equipment auction, but the small ones, a hand plane his father had given him in 1969, a set of chisels. He noticed things about the house that first week he hadn't let himself notice while signing for it. The kitchen window looked out on a chain-link fence, and past it the neighbor's above-ground pool, drained for the season, holding 3 inches of rainwater gone green. The water heater was the kind that took 20 minutes to recover between showers. The walls were thin enough that he could hear the television next door most evenings, though he never once heard a voice that sounded like Doris's through them, which struck him later as strange, given how much she eventually came to say to him in person. The floor in the hallway sloped half an inch toward the bathroom, enough that a dropped coin would roll there on its own. Scout did not settle the first few nights. He paced the small rooms, sniffed at the baseboards, and twice stood at the back door scratching at it the way he used to scratch to be let into the shop, before he finally gave up and lay down across the threshold between the kitchen and the only bedroom, as if guarding the smallest possible perimeter he could still call his own. Walter understood that better than he could have explained to anyone. He had spent 41 years with 380 acres to walk, and now had a yard he could cross in 9 steps. And some nights that fact arrived in his chest, sideways the way grief does without warning and without asking permission. The 4th box was the one he had packed himself last, after the movers Curtis hired had already loaded the truck with everything they considered worth loading. It held his father's pocket watch, Carol Ann's wedding ring in its box, 3 photographs, his wedding day, his son at age 9 on a tractor too big for him, and Otto Henneman standing in front of the shop the week it was finished in 1986. He sat with that 4th box the longest, on the floor of a kitchen that was not his, with the dog's head on his knee, and understood that everything in it was the only inheritance Curtis had not managed to put a number on. He decided that night, without saying it out loud to anyone, that whatever else happened, that box did not get sold, did not get signed away, did not become anyone's leverage. It was the one thing he still got to choose. He did not cry. He had not cried since the funeral, and he did not start that night either. What he did, sitting on that step with the dog's weight against his leg, was begin, for the first time in 11 months, to think clearly about what he still had. Not what he'd lost. What was still his. He remembered the triangle, the way you remember a thing you have not thought about in years. Not because it returns to you, but because something jars it loose. It was the deed box. He had seen that envelope 100 times over the years and never opened it, because his father had told him once, when Walter was maybe 30, that the acre was rock and didn't matter, and he should leave it be. And Walter, who had trusted his father's word on everything else about that farm for 40 years, he opened it on the second night, at the kitchen table on Ash Street, with Scout asleep on the floor, and the porch light from next door throwing a thin yellow line across the linoleum. Inside the envelope was the original 1958 partition deed, a separate parcel number, a hand-drawn plat showing the triangle's exact boundaries against the railroad right-of-way, and a single sheet of onion skin paper, typed dated November 1958 from a geologist named R.W. Pruitt, addressed to Otto Henneman. That Walter read twice before he understood what he was holding. The letter was 3 paragraphs, typed on a manual typewriter, with a faint hitch in the lowercase e, the kind of imperfection Walter recognized from old farm records his father had kept. It referenced a favorable aggregate showing along the rail cut at the southwest corner of the Henneman property, and a proposed compensation arrangement from the State Highway Commission for mineral rights access, contingent on further survey. It did not say what Otto had decided. It only proved that, in 1958, someone had told him there might be something there, and that his father had filed the partition paperwork to separate that acre from the rest of the farm within 4 months of the letter's date. Not an accident, Walter understood now, but a decision made deliberately and never explained to anyone. Walter sat with that letter a long time that second night, at a kitchen table in a house that was not his, with a dog who had nowhere else to be either, holding a letter from 1958 he did not yet fully understand. The house next door belonged to a woman named Doris Kells, 68, who had lived on Ash Street for 30 years and noticed, the way people who live alone for a long time learn to notice things, that the old man who'd moved in on the 1st of September kept his porch light on until 2 in the morning. She brought over a plate of kolaches on the 4th day, the way you do in that part of Kansas when someone new moves in, not because she expected anything from it. She had been widowed 11 years since her husband Frank died of lung cancer in 2014, a diagnosis that had come 8 months after he retired from 31 years at the grain elevator on the east end of town. She had worked the front desk at the county extension office for 26 years before her own retirement, fielding everything from soil test requests to 4-H paperwork to the occasional farmer wanting to argue about a fence line. And she had developed, over that quarter-century, an instinct for which problems were really about what they appeared to be about and which ones were not. "You're the Henneman place, out east," she said, not as a question. "My husband used to buy seedweed off your dad. 40 years ago, maybe more." She was widowed herself, 11 years now, had worked the front desk at the county extension office for 26 years before she retired. And she had a way of saying very little while clearly seeing a great deal, which Walter noticed and did not yet trust, the way he had stopped trusting easy kindness sometime in the last 18 months. "That's right," Walter said. "Used to be. Anyway." "Used to be," Doris repeated, and looked at him for a second longer than the words required, and then said only, "Well, dog looks like he could use some water," and went back inside, leaving the kolaches on the step. It took Walter 3 more days to bring the onion skin letter over and ask her, since she'd worked at the extension office, whether she knew anything about a geologist named Pruitt, who'd have been working this county in 1958. He almost didn't go. He had spent 18 months learning the hard way what it cost to hand a stranger a piece of paper and trust them with what was inside it. But Doris had brought the kolaches and asked nothing in return, twice now. And Walter had farmed long enough to know that a man who waits for guaranteed safety before he plants anything never gets a crop in the ground at all. She read the letter twice at her own kitchen table, the way Walter had, and then looked up at him with an expression Walter had not seen, aimed at himself, in a very long time. Not pity, which he had gotten used to, but something closer to attention. "This is a sand and gravel survey," she said. 1958, this part of the county. They were starting to map aggregate deposits for the highway expansion. Pruitt worked for the State Highway Commission before he went private. If he wrote your dad a letter like this, it's because he found something on that ground he thought your dad needed to know about. "It's an acre of rock," Walter said. "Always has been. Nothing's ever grown on it." "That," Doris said, setting the letter down carefully, like it might still be worth something, even folded, "might be exactly the point." Walter went out to the triangle itself the next afternoon, for the first time in he could not say how many years. Parking Doris's loaner car at the section line and walking in on foot because there was no real road, just a cattle path gone to weed. He stood at the fence 15 minutes before he went in, the way he used to stand at the edge of a field before the first pass of spring, taking its measure. It was, up close, exactly what everyone had always said it was. The fence on the north side had collapsed in 3 places. The posts rotted off below grade, and the wire pooled in rusted coils in the grass. Box elder and Russian olive had taken the low corner near the drainage cut, dense enough in places that Walter had to turn sideways to get through. The ground itself was hard pan clay over rock, the kind of soil that had never once in Walter's lifetime held a crop worth the diesel to plant it. A coyote den sat under an old fence post pile near the railroad side. There was a rusted single-bottom plow, abandoned sometime before Walter was born, half buried at the low end, its beam orange with rust and its share long gone to dust. He walked the whole acre slowly, the way he used to walk a new field, before deciding how to till it, noting what he saw the way he had been trained his whole life to notice ground, where the water sat after rain, where the grass grew thicker than it should for soil this poor, where the railroad cut had exposed 8 feet of bare earth along the right-of-way. Layers of clay over what looked, even to an untrained eye standing in the afternoon light, like coarse pale gravel running the length of the cut. He had walked past that exposed bank 100 times over 40 years, and never once stopped to look at it, because his father had told him, when Walter was 30, that the acre was rock and didn't matter, and Walter had simply believed him the way a son believes a father. He stood at that railroad cut a long time, long enough that Scout grew bored and wandered off to investigate the coyote den, long enough that the light shifted and the exposed pale layer in the bank caught it differently than it had 10 minutes before. Walter had spent 41 years reading ground for a living, knowing by sight where water pooled, where clay turned to better loam, where a field would yield and where it wouldn't, and some part of that same eye dormant for 33 years on this particular acre, because his father had told him not to use it, was waking back up. Then he went back to Doris's and called Lonnie Brant. He called Renee that same evening too, before he called Lonnie, though he hadn't planned to. It was the first time in 4 months he had picked up the phone to call her, rather than waited for her to call him. She sounded surprised to hear his voice, then careful, the way she had sounded careful with him since the funeral, as though she suspected something might be wrong, simply because he dialed first. "I'm fine," Walter said before she could ask. "I just wanted to tell you I found something out at the old place. Your grandfather's. I'll tell you more once I know more myself." "Is it bad?" Renee said. "No," Walter said, and found saying it, that he meant it in a way he hadn't expected to mean anything that week. I don't think it's bad at all. They talked 12 minutes longer than either of them had talked in over a year, about nothing in particular. Her daughter's volleyball season, a roof leak Renee's husband hadn't gotten to yet, and Walter did not bring up Curtis once because some other part of this needed settling before he brought his daughter into it, and because, for the first time since March, the silence on the line between them had felt like rest instead of distance. She knew a man, she said, retired now, who used to work mineral rights title searches out of Goodland. Lonnie Brandt, 71, half-deaf in one ear from 40 years of drill rigs, who still did the occasional title search for cash because he said retirement bored him worse than work ever had. He'd worked 38 years for 2 different oil and gas survey outfits before retiring, and had developed, in that time, a reputation in 3 counties for being the man you called when something didn't look right, and you needed someone who wouldn't tell anyone else what he found until you said so. She called him on a Thursday. He came out the following Tuesday, in a truck older than Walter's had been, with a metal detector, a soil probe, and a folder of his own. Lonnie walked the triangle for 2 hours, while Walter stood at the fence line with Scout, watching a man half his own age move across rock and box elder scrub like it was telling him something. Lonnie didn't say much while he worked. He took samples in small plastic bags, marked each one with a grease pencil, and twice got down on one knee at the drainage cut along the railroad right-of-way and looked at the exposed bank for a long time without speaking. He used the soil probe at 6 different points across the acre, driving it down by hand till it hit refusal, and each time he pulled it back out, he held the core sample up to the light and rubbed a pinch of it between his fingers before he said anything. At the 3rd point, nearest the cut, he stopped rubbing and just looked at it. "You feel that," he said, holding it out to Walter. "That's not clay all the way down, that's clay over something with some grit to it." Walter took the sample and rubbed it the way Lonnie had, the way he'd handled 1,000 soil samples over 41 years of farming, though never once for this reason. "Feels like road base," he said. "It is road base," Lonnie said. "Or it will be, once somebody crushes it to spec. That's the thing about gravel. Walter, nobody ever thinks they're standing on money because it doesn't look like money. It looks like the thing you'd throw away. Your acre sits on top of a sand and gravel deposit that the 1958 survey estimated at around 40,000 cubic yards," he said finally, back at the fence, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Pruitt's numbers, if they hold up, which I've got no reason yet to think they don't." That railroad cut exposed it for him. He'd have told your dad because the state was buying gravel rights up and down this line for highway base material, and your dad's acre sat right where the rail spur made hauling it out cheap. Otto turned them down. I don't know why. But he kept the letter, which tells me he knew exactly what he was sitting on. 40,000 yards is worth what? Walter said. It was the first time in 18 months he had asked a number out loud expecting the answer to matter. Today's market, delivered to a county road project. Conservative. I'd want a current engineering survey before anybody quotes a number that means anything in court. But conservative, Lonnie said. You are not looking at nothing. You are looking at 6 figures. Maybe more if the seam runs as deep as that letter suggests and nobody's pulled gravel off it since. Walter did not say anything for a while. Scout leaned against his leg. The wind moved through the box elder. The way it had moved through it, every day of Walter's life, that he had walked past this fence and seen nothing but a triangle of land his father told him to leave alone. Nobody's pulled gravel off it, Walter said finally, because nobody but me and my dad ever knew it was here. And he's the only other man who ever held that deed. Curtis, that same week, was telling a loan officer in Salina that the Henneman acquisition, that was the word he used, acquisition, had gone clean, no complications, family was very understanding. While he priced out a center pivot irrigation system for the 380 acres he now believed was the entirety of what his great-uncle had ever owned. He had already listed the Ash Street house as a rental on a property management site 3 weeks before Walter had even unpacked the second box. Confident enough in how this story ended that he had stopped thinking about Walter at all. If you've made it this far into Walter Henneman's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Lonnie's preliminary numbers were not enough to act on, and Walter knew it. A grease pencil estimate from a retired title man was not a deed, was not a bonded survey, was not anything Curtis's lawyers couldn't tear apart in an afternoon if Walter walked in waving it like proof. What Walter had instead, sitting at Doris Kells's kitchen table with Lonnie's notes spread between 3 coffee cups, was something his father had given him without either of them knowing it at the time: patience and the knowledge of exactly which county office held exactly which document, because Walter Henneman had spent 41 years filing easements, partition records, and crop insurance claims in those same offices, and he knew, the way Curtis never would, that the truth of a thing in rural Kansas is never decided by who shouts loudest. It is decided by who has the older paper. The first thing Walter needed was the bonded survey Lonnie had warned him about, something a court or a buyer would actually trust. That cost $2,400 money Walter did not have sitting in any account, since every dollar he'd had gone into the finance company's $13,000 hole 8 months earlier. He sold his father's pocket watch, the one item from the deed box he could bear to part with, to a collector in Hayes who'd been after Otto Henneman's old Hamilton Railroad watch for 11 years, and paid $2,650 without negotiating, because he'd wanted it that badly. Walter used the extra $250 to buy 4 new fence posts. He fixed the fence first, not because the fence mattered to anyone's survey or anyone's deed, but because a man does not let a thing he is about to fight for sit there sagging, and because his hands had not built anything in 11 months and needed the work the way his lungs needed air. He set the posts himself, 3 feet deep, the way his father had taught him in 1962, tapping the dirt in 6-inch lifts so it wouldn't settle loose, and stretched new wire over Labor Day weekend while Doris brought out coffee twice, and Scout supervised from the shade of the only box elder big enough to throw any. "You don't have to make it pretty," Doris said the second time, handing him a thermos lid full of black coffee. "You're not selling it to a magazine." "I know," Walter said. "I just don't like a sagging fence." She laughed at that, the first real laugh he'd heard from her, and something in Walter, unclenched slightly, that he hadn't realized, was clenched. The surveyor, a woman named Priya Anand out of Hayes who did engineering surveys for 3 counties, came out on a Tuesday in late September with a drone and a soil auger and spent 6 hours on the acre, taking core samples at 9 points across the triangle and running them against the railroad cut's exposed face. She'd done aggregate surveys for 18 years, long enough to have seen, she told Walter while she worked, every kind of acre that turned out to be worth 10 times what the tax assessor said, and every kind that turned out to be worth nothing at all once you actually dug into it. And she made a point of telling Walter, before she ever quoted him a number, that she charged the same flat fee, regardless of what the survey found, so he'd have no reason to doubt the result one way or the other. She came back with numbers 11 days later that made Lonnie's grease pencil estimate look conservative. 44,000 cubic yards of Class II base aggregate certified, with a current market value delivered processed, sold to the 3 road construction outfits actively bidding on a county highway expansion 40 minutes east of $7.4 a yard, gross. Walter sat with that number at Doris's kitchen table for a long time before he said it out loud. The way you handle something heavy before you're sure your hands can hold it. $325,600. Gross before extraction costs, which Priya estimated conservatively, would run somewhere around 40% of gross for a deposit this size and this accessible. Walter did the subtraction in his head, the way he'd done crop yield math his whole life, and arrived at something just under $200,000 net, more than 3 times what Curtis's predatory little loan had ever pretended to forgive him. Sitting on an acre everyone, including Walter himself for 33 years, had called worthless. He did not run to a lawyer, waving the number. He went instead to the Thomas County Register of Deeds with the 1958 partition document and asked, the way he had asked 100 bureaucratic questions over 41 years of farming, what the proper procedure was for confirming a parcel's chain of title when a more recent transfer document had failed to reference it. The clerk, a woman who'd known Walter's name from crop insurance filings since before she'd been hired, pulled the record in 11 minutes and confirmed what Walter already knew. The Henneman Triangle, parcel 1419014002, had never transferred. It still sat on paper, exactly where his father's death had left it. In Walter's name alone, the lawyer Walter hired was not flashy. Marlene Doss had practiced agricultural and estate law out of a storefront office in Colby for 34 years, had a framed photograph of her late husband's combine on the wall instead of any diploma you could see from the door, and charged Walter $185,100. She read the August transfer documents, the partition deed, and Priya's survey in one sitting, and then looked at Walter over her glasses. Marlene had grown up on a wheat farm outside Goodland herself, had watched her own father lose 40 acres in a boundary dispute in the 1,970 seconds to a neighbor with better lawyers, and had gone to law school specifically, she told Walter once, so that never happened to anybody else in this county on my watch if I could help it. She kept a single framed newspaper clipping in her office, yellowed and small, about the case she'd won 11 years out of law school that had finally let her father's family reclaim part of that boundary. And Walter understood, looking at it, that he had found, by accident, exactly the kind of lawyer who would take what had happened to him personally, in a way that mattered. Your nephew's lawyer made an error that happens about twice a year in this county and ends careers when it does, she said. He pulled a legal description off a tax statement instead of doing an actual title search. That's malpractice, technically, on his end, not yours. The triangle was never part of what you transferred because it was never described in what you signed. You don't need to undo the August transaction at all. You already own this. You always did. What about the house? Walter said. What about the rest of it? That, Marlene said, is a separate conversation, and a harder one. Because you did sign that, with your name and your understanding at the time, even if the circumstances around how you got to that signature might interest a judge. I'd want to look hard at whether Curtis's company had a duty to disclose its own shell ownership before I'd advise you on whether to fight the rest. But the triangle isn't a fight. The triangle is just yours. Walter went home that night, to Ash Street, to 612 square feet, and 2 working burners, and sat on the back step with Scout, and did not feel triumphant. He felt, mostly, tired in a different way than he had been tired for 11 months. Tired the way a man is tired after a full day of honest work, instead of tired the way grief makes you tired, which has no bottom to it. October brought the first real cold, and Walter began, in the evenings, going back out to the triangle most days, with Doris's old extension office contacts now returning his calls instead of Curtis's. He learned, over 6 weeks, 3 things he hadn't known a year earlier. How to read an aggregate extraction lease, what county road departments actually paid for delivered base material versus what brokers quoted. And that Lonnie Brandt, for $40 an hour, and the pleasure of being asked would help him negotiate every line of it. The lease Walter signed in November was with the county itself. Not a private broker, Marlene's idea, since a county contract couldn't be challenged or undercut the way a private buyer's could. And because the county's own highway expansion needed exactly what sat under that acre. The terms were $6.1 a yard net to Walter, paid on extraction volume, rather than a single lump sum, which Marlene said would protect him if Curtis tried to claim any part of it once word got out. The first extraction was scheduled for the following March, after frost-out, when the ground would hold equipment without rutting. Through the winter, Walter did the one piece of the work that was entirely his own. He built, by hand in the shop space Doris's late husband had left standing, empty behind her house, and let Walter use rent-free in exchange for fixing her gutters. A small-scale model of the extraction site access road. Drainage diversion. The way he used to plan every field's tiled drainage before he ever ran the first pass with the tractor. He was 74 years old, and his hip ground in the cold the way it always had. And he did not stop for it, because stopping for it had never once, in 41 years, gotten a field planted on time. He spent 4 weekends in January grading the access road himself with a borrowed skid loader, working it the same way he'd worked terraces into hillside ground decades earlier, crowned slightly in the center, ditched on both sides, packed in 3-inch lifts so spring thaw wouldn't turn it to soup. Lonnie came out twice to check his grade with the transit level and told him, both times, that the road was better built than half the county-maintained roads he'd driven on getting there. The work was not without setbacks. The skid loader's hydraulic line split open on the second weekend, in 11-degree weather, leaving Walter stranded a half-mile from the nearest working phone signal until Dale Pruitt happened to drive past on his way to check his own cattle and stop when he saw the machine sitting dead in the field. They patched the line together with a coupling from Dale's own shop and got it running again by dusk, though Walter lost most of that Saturday to it and had to push the remaining grading into a 5th weekend he hadn't planned for. His hip gave him trouble that whole stretch, worse than usual, the cold, finding every place the joint had worn thin, and there were 2 mornings in late January when he sat at the kitchen table on Ash Street for 20 minutes before he trusted himself to stand up straight and drive out to the site at all. He did not mention the hip to Doris, not because he was hiding it from her exactly, but because mentioning it felt like giving the cold more credit than it deserved. She noticed anyway, the way she noticed most things, and started leaving a second set of work gloves and a tin of liniment on his porch step without ever bringing it up directly, and Walter used both without ever bringing it up either. And that was how the two of them had apparently decided to handle most things by then. He cleared the box elder from the low corner with a chainsaw he'd borrowed from a neighbor 3 sections over, a man named Dale Pruitt, who'd farmed alongside Walter's family for 2 generations and had heard, second-hand, through the co-op, some version of what Curtis had done. Dale was 66, had taken over his own father's 640 acres in 1989, the same year Walter had inherited the triangle without knowing it, and the 2 men had shared combines, parts, and the occasional bad harvest for the better part of 3 decades without ever once needing to say much about it directly. Dale didn't ask questions when Walter came to borrow the saw. He just handed it over with a full tank of mix and said, "Bring it back whenever," which in that part of Kansas was its own kind of testimony. He rebuilt the fence a second time that February, not because the first repair had failed, but because the extraction boundary needed a tighter line than a cattle fence required. And Marlene had told him a clearly marked surveyed boundary would matter, if anyone ever questioned where the triangle ended and Curtis's 380 acres began. Walter set 11 new corner posts in frozen ground that month, breaking through the top 6 inches with a digging bar before the auger could get any purchase. The same cold weather trick his father had taught him 60 years earlier. And Doris brought coffee out to the fence line most Saturdays that winter, and somewhere around the 3rd or 4th time she stopped asking if he wanted company and started simply showing up with 2 thermoses instead of 1. She did not pretend to know anything about gravel leases or extraction contracts. What she did instead, Walter noticed, was ask the kind of plain question nobody else thought to ask, not, "How's it going?" but, "What's today's piece of it?" which made him explain things out loud in a way that helped him see, sometimes.
Yeah.
"Ever worry he comes back around once the money starts showing?" Doris asked one Saturday in February, watching Walter check the level on a corner post. "Every day," Walter said. "That's why I'm doing it through the county, and not some broker Curtis could talk his way into a piece of county. Doesn't care whose nephew anybody is." She nodded at that and didn't ask again, though she kept bringing the second thermos every week after. Curtis, meanwhile, defaulted quietly on the irrigation system he'd financed against the 380 acres he believed he fully owned, after a dry July showed him the leased ground's yields weren't what he'd projected when he'd done his own math with no farming experience behind it. He started calling the property a headache to the loan officer in Salina. He had stopped calling Walter at all by November, having gotten as far as he was concerned everything there was to get. The first trucks came out to the Triangle on the 14th of March, after a hard frost out that left the ground firm enough to hold a loader without rutting. Walter was there before sunup, the way he'd been there before sunup for every planting season of his adult life, standing at the fence with a thermos of coffee and Scout at his heel, watching a county contractor named Hal Driscoll walk the access road Walter had cleared by hand over the winter, and nod once, satisfied, the way a man nods when a job has already been done correctly before he got there. Driscoll's crew set up a portable scale at the gate that first morning, weighing each truck loaded and empty to calculate exact tonnage, and Walter stood with a clipboard of his own beside the county inspector for the first 3 loads, just to see the numbers come off the scale with his own eyes before he trusted anyone else's count of them. The first truck out carried 22.4 tons. By noon, 6 trucks had made the round trip to the highway staging yard and back, and Walter had watched every single one of them weigh in and weigh out, the way he used to watch every truck off his own combine at harvest, because a man who has been cheated once does not stop counting just because the numbers are finally working in his favor. Renee drove out from Wichita the second weekend of the extraction, having heard enough by then over the phone that she wanted to see it herself. She stood at the fence beside her father, watching the stockpile grow by the hour, and didn't say much at first, the way her father didn't say much either when something mattered too much for talking. "Grandpa Otto knew this the whole time," she said finally. 60-some years, and he never told anybody. "Told me to leave it be," Walter said. I think now he was protecting it. Didn't know from who, exactly. "Just knew it was worth protecting from Curtis," Renee said. "From anybody," Walter said. "Curtis just happened to be who showed up." She brought her daughter out the following month, the first time the 3 of them had stood on that ground together since before Carol Ann died, and Walter watched his granddaughter pick up a chunk of the crushed gravel and turn it over in her hand the way Lonnie had taught him to read a soil sample, asking question after question about how rock under clay could be worth more than the wheat that used to grow on top of it, and Walter found himself, for the first time in over a year, explaining something to someone younger than him, instead of being managed by someone who thought he couldn't understand his own affairs. By April, the extraction had cleared the first 6,000 yards, and the county's check, $36,600. The first of what Marlene called the volume payments. went into an account Walter had opened under his own name at the bank on Main Street, a bank that had no relationship of any kind with the finance company Curtis had built his career on. Walter used $4,000 of it to buy back the pocket watch from the collector in Hayes, who sold it back to him for exactly what he'd paid. No markup, saying only that a man should get to keep his father's watch if he was willing to ask twice. Lonnie came out to the triangle twice during the extraction itself, not because Walter needed him to anymore, but because he said he wanted to see his number prove out against the survey. And both times he walked the stockpile with the same grease pencil in his shirt pocket, marking nothing now, just looking. The second time, in May, he stood at the edge of the access road and shook his head slowly. 44 years I did this work, he said, and I can count on one hand the times I got to watch somebody actually collect on ground everybody else had already written off. Most of the time you find the number, and somebody with deeper pockets buys the rights out from under whoever found it first. Nobody bought me out, Walter said. No, Lonnie said. You didn't sell anybody the number. You just used it. He didn't say anything else about it, just nodded once, and got back in his truck, and Walter understood it for the compliment it was. He used the rest that spring. On lawyers. Not to fight the August transfer outright, the way Garrity had warned him 8 months might cost more than it was worth, but to put Marlene Doss on retainer to formally investigate whether Curtis's finance company had disclosed its own ownership before Walter signed. It was a slower fight than Walter had first wanted. It was also, Marlene told him more than once, the only kind of fight that actually held up once a judge started asking questions. Curtis found out about the triangle in the second week of May, not from Walter, but from a clerk at the Register of Deeds office who mentioned it, in passing, to Curtis's lawyer while pulling an unrelated record. A chain of title inquiry on the Henneman parcel that had a hold flag on it now, Marlene's doing, pending the broader investigation into the August transfer. Curtis drove out to the triangle himself 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, in the Ram pickup that had cost $58,000 new and was by then 4 payments. He pulled up at the section line and walked in the same way Walter had walked in 8 months earlier, on foot, because there was still no real road in from that side. The access road Walter had graded running only as far as the extraction boundary, and no farther toward the public section line. What he saw stopped him before he reached the fence. A graded access road running clean to the railroad cut. A stockpile of crushed gravel 40 feet long and chest high. A county contractor's flagging tape still strung along the extraction boundary. A second, smaller stockpile of finer material set apart from the first. And Walter Henneman standing at the edge of it with a clipboard, going over a delivery manifest the way he used to go over a seed order. Curtis stood at the fence a long moment before he spoke. His jaw worked once. He looked at the stockpile, then at Walter, then back at the stockpile, the way a man looks at a number he is trying to make come out differently, by looking at it harder. His boots, Walter noticed, were the kind that had never once touched a field. Clean, expensive, entirely wrong for the ground he was standing on. "What is this?" Curtis said. It was the only thing he said for several seconds, and it came out smaller than he probably meant it to. "It's gravel," Walter said. 44,000 yards of it, give or take. County's been hauling it out since March. He did not look up from the manifest. "This is my land," Curtis said. "I bought this land." "No," Walter said, and set the clipboard down on the tailgate of his truck, the only truck he had now, a used half-ton he bought outright in February with extraction money. "You bought 380 acres off a tax statement your own lawyer pulled without checking the county recorder first. This acre was never on that tax statement. It's never been anywhere but in my name, same as it's been since 1989. Curtis didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the box elder at the low corner, the same wind that had moved through it Walter's whole life. Somewhere behind him a county loader started up, and Curtis flinched slightly at the sound of it. The way you flinch at a thing that has already decided something without asking you. "Your own lawyer's mistake," Walter said. "Not mine." "I didn't hide it from you, Curtis. I never lied to you about a single thing. You just never asked what was actually on the deed. You were in too big a hurry to ask." "I was helping you," Curtis said, and even he seemed to hear for the first time how thin it sounded out loud. Away from the kitchen table, away from the casserole, standing at a fence in front of a stockpile of gravel that had just made his great-uncle more money than the finance company had ever pretended to forgive him. Walter didn't answer that at all. He picked the clipboard back up, made a note on the manifest, and turned toward the contractor's truck because there was a delivery coming through in 10 minutes and the gate needed to be open for it. He did not watch Curtis walk back to the section line. Scout did, ears up, until the ram's engine started and pulled away. And then the dog lay back down in the shade of the stockpile and did not get up again until the next delivery truck's engine drew his attention. Curtis stood at the fence a while longer. Nobody told him to leave. Nobody needed to. He drove back to Selena that evening, and according to what Doris heard secondhand from her cousin who worked at the courthouse, never filed anything contesting the triangle at all. Because Marlene's investigation into the August transfer had by then turned up enough about the Shell Finance Company that Curtis's own lawyer advised him, in writing, that pursuing anything further would only invite more scrutiny onto exactly how that loan had been structured in the first place. The investigation Marlene ran that spring turned up 3 other elderly clients in 2 counties who had signed similar refinancing agreements with the same Shell company in the 18 months before Walter had, 2 of whom had also lost their homes outright, with no acre anyone had forgotten to put on a tax statement to save them. Marlene referred those cases to the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division in May, attaching Walter's documents as the clearest paper trail of the pattern, and Curtis's finance company stopped originating new loans entirely by June, though Marlene told Walter it would likely be a year or more before anything came of the broader investigation. If anything ever did. By July, with the extraction nearly 2/3 complete, and the volume payments running close to $190,000 net, Walter sat down with Marlene one more time, and she came back 6 weeks later with a settlement Curtis's side agreed to, rather than face a deposition. The August transfer would stand as recorded. Curtis kept the 380 acres. Ground he had by then proven he didn't know how to farm, and couldn't afford to lease out twice in a row, but the Ash Street house reverted fully and permanently to Walter, free and clear, along with a payment of $22,000 to cover what Marlene's filing called documented damages arising from inadequate disclosure, which was the lawyer's way of saying Curtis's company had never told Walter who actually owned the debt he'd signed against. Walter used some of that money to buy 4 acres adjoining the triangle that had come up for sale that same summer, ground nobody else wanted because it backed up against the railroad cut. The same way the triangle did, ground a survey crew, confirmed in August, sat on the same gravel seam, extending it. He spent the rest mostly on the house on Ash Street. Not to make it bigger, which it would never be, but to fix the things that had been broken the whole time he'd lived in it. The 2 dead burners replaced with a proper 4-burner range he picked out himself at the hardware store on Main Street, the mildewed caulk in the bathroom. Stripped and redone correctly this time with proper ventilation added so it wouldn't happen again. The sloped hallway floor, shimmed and leveled over a long weekend with Dale Pruitt's help, the same neighbor who'd lent him the chainsaw without asking a single question. The back step had been loose since before he'd ever moved in. He fixed it in 40 minutes with tools from his own truck, the same way he'd once fixed a church step the week before his wife's funeral, setting a new ledger board and shimming the stringers level the way he'd learned from his father, 60 years before either of them had ever heard the word easement. Scout was 14 that September, slower on the stairs than he'd been, but still at Walter's heel every morning when Walter walked the 4 new acres at first light, the way he'd walked fields his whole life, checking what the night had done to the ground while he slept. He had outlived the winter. Curtis had predicted he wouldn't, and Walter had stopped mentioning that fact out loud to anyone, the way you stop mentioning the obvious once it's been proven often enough. Renee came out twice that summer with her daughter, and the second visit lasted 3 days instead of an afternoon. The longest the two of them had spent under one roof since before Carol Ann died. Nobody made a speech about it. Walter simply set up the spare room properly for the first time, bought a real bed instead of leaving the air mattress folded in the closet. And on the second night, sitting on the back step after his granddaughter had gone to sleep, Renee said, "I should have called more this last year." And Walter said, "So should I." And that was the whole conversation. And it was enough. Doris came over most evenings by then, not because either of them had said anything formal about it, but because it had simply become the shape their days took. Coffee on the back step, sometimes a meal, sometimes just sitting while Scout worked his way slowly around the small yard that Walter had decided was exactly the right size for a man who no longer needed 380 acres to know what he was worth. On a Tuesday evening in late September, 13 months after he had first sat on that same step with nothing but 4 boxes and a dog, Walter sat there again with Doris beside him, watching the gravel trucks make their last run of the day out at the triangle, visible as a thin line of dust against the horizon if you knew exactly where to look. The back step held steady under them, freshly leveled. The new caulk in the bathroom, finally holding against the water, the way it was supposed to. Scout lay across both their feet, the way he had taken to doing his breathing slow and even in the cooling air. The smell of cut grass drifted over from the yard Walter had mowed that afternoon, mixed with the first hint of wood smoke from somewhere down the block where someone had started their first fire of the season. A truck passed on the street out front, slowed briefly at the stop sign, and moved on. Inside the house, the new range Walter had installed in July still smelled faintly of the protective coating on its burners, not yet fully cooked off after 2 months of light use. "You ever think you'd end up back here?" Doris said. "After all that, I never left," Walter said. "Just took the rest of them a while to notice." The porch light came on automatically at dusk, the way Walter had finally gotten around to wiring it that spring, and it held steady and yellow against the early dark. The small house on Ash Street standing solid behind them, paid for twice over and owned outright, the way Walter Henneman had always believed a thing should be.